The entire structure of the internet, and thus all of its power and danger, from popular consumer technologies to social media and state and private surveillance capabilities, are tied to the technology that undergirds it, the silicon chip. That integrated chip, or semiconductor, at the heart of every computer is the physical mechanism that creates the ones and zeros of binary code and drives the internet. What if that weren't the basis for computing anymore? Meanwhile, the future of machine learning, or what some now call deep learning, really lies just ahead of us. Facebook has a system known as DeepFace that is capable of correctly identifying a face 97% of the time. That's a performance that is both unexpectedly good and, candidly, probably better than most human capabilities. So what happens now? What are the right rules to apply when computing power outstrips our current imagination, or when the human control element is no longer part of the equation? What do we think of robot surveillance systems that independently choose their own targeting? And of course, we can also ask an even more speculative question. What if these independent machine agents are capable of taking action based on what they observe? Say, detaining humans, or even disabling them. We need to think about the resulting social perils and opportunities of quantum computing and artificial intelligence in the context of civil liberties and state security, in autocracies and democracies alike. These are revolutionary possibilities. But like our predecessors from the Bronze Age to the age of quartz, it is also our responsibility to think about the future, for ourselves and for those who come after us. It is not unlike thinking, what if we had something that went faster than the horse and buggy? Well, without knowing precisely what that something might be, you can imagine still how great a paradigm shift it could be, even if you don't know precisely what it's actually going to be. We might, just might, today be standing on the threshold of such a change. Physicists have developed the concept of a quantum computer. That is, a computer whose operations are based on theories of quantum physics, in the same way that our current crop of computers is based on the operation of classical Newtonian physics laws. The physicists whose theoretical work is at the heart of this potential revolution won a Nobel Prize for their breakthrough. In quantum physics, it is possible for a particle to be in two places simultaneously, and to be entangled with other particles, and affect their activity instantaneously, even when the particles are far apart. This latter is what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. The transformation that would come from the development of a quantum computer is stunning. In a classic computer, the one you and I use, each and every bit of data can either be a 1 or a 0. Every concept we communicate today, every word, every picture, is just a string of these ones and zeros. In a quantum computer, the qubit, that's short for quantum bit, can be a 1 or a 0, or both a 1 and a 0 at the same time. And when qubits are entangled with each other, they can, in theory, share information instantaneously, in effect enabling all the entangled qubits to work on a single problem simultaneously, like some massive set of connected classical computers. If ever created, these quantum computers would make the power of contemporary computers look puny by comparison. Much as the car or the airplane or the spaceship leaves the horse and buggy behind. Because of the indefinite nature of a qubit state, with all the ones and zeros capable of being both on and off at the same time, a 2-qubit system can compute 4 values at once. A 3-qubit system, 8 values, a 4-qubit system, 16, and so on. This kind of computing power can have immense benefits. Increases in cyberspeed powered much of the technological revolution that we've experienced in recent decades. Quantum computers, if they're ever successfully built, means that computers might be smaller, faster, and possibly even cheaper in the long run, meaning that you could actually imagine a day when your computer is a small appliance you wear as a pinky ring. On the other hand, vast computing power brings with it some obvious dangers. Current encryption programs, for example, are based on large prime number multiplication, and they're amazingly robust and difficult to break. But theoretical physicists have shown that for a quantum computer, the factoring of a large number into its prime number factors and the breaking of prime number encryption codes would be trivial. Not long ago, a quantum computer successfully factored the number 15, suggesting that the theoretical capacity to break prime number encryption might eventually become reality. So, although we're just at the beginning, such developments are not merely theoretical. At Oxford and at Yale, theoreticians have built 4 and 8 qubit large computing chips. When they get up to roughly 50 qubits, the computing power will match that of a contemporary laptop. Meanwhile, entrepreneurs in Singapore and in Canada are working on the same question. And Google has been exploring quantum computing for years. When will a large quantum computer be built? Possibly never. But if one is produced, well. So now, let's look at the human-computer interface. It blows one's mind to learn that the US Army is working to develop drones that can be deployed and controlled by human thought. Nonetheless, that's the case. Scientists at the University of Texas at San Antonio got a grant from the military to do just that. It's been reported that the researchers got one grant from the Office of the Secretary of Defense for $300,000 to investigate the possibility of military personnel using brain signals to operate drones for surveillance, intelligence, and reconnaissance missions. This came with a companion Pentagon grant of $400,000 that allowed the University of Texas to buy 2 top-of-the-line electroencephalograms, or EEG systems. That is, systems which are designed to measure and report out brain waves. The plan of the researchers is to start small with very small drones, like those employed by hobbyists. The long-term goal, which again may never be realized, is to have soldiers flying large military drones, like the MQ-4C Triton, via thought control, navigating with the power of their own minds. Interestingly, a development like this might not require much change in our thinking about law and policy. After all, whatever the legal rules are that we develop to govern drone use and airspace rights, what difference will it make if they're flown by brainpower? In one sense, the difference really won't matter. But in other ways, small increases in technological capability and ease of utility tend to transform themselves into larger disruptions of settled expectations. Think back to the criminal case of Mr. Antoine Jones, whose car federal authorities tracked with a global positioning satellite system, or GPS device, which they attached to his car in a public parking lot. He was a suspected drug dealer, and the FBI used the device to trail him to the stash house where he hid his drugs. The government explained that it could have tracked Mr. Jones using police officers in undercover vehicles, and that following him with a surreptitiously placed GPS tracker was no different. Jones's legal objection, which I found quite persuasive, was based in part upon how GPS trackers constituted much greater ease of use in police surveillance operations. They required fewer police resources and are much less likely to be detected by the person being tracked than would be a team of undercover police officers. That argument resonated in the Supreme Court. Justice Samuel Alito wrote, It is almost impossible to think of historical situations that are analogous to what took place in this case. Is it possible to imagine a case in which a constable secreted himself somewhere in a horse-drawn coach and remained there for a period of time in order to monitor the movements of the coach's owner? This would have required either a gigantic coach or a very teeny constable, or both, not to mention a constable with incredible fortitude and patience. The same can likely be said of mind control technology, or if we might, offer technological ease of use so great that it winds up making a real difference in law and policy. Instead of having to carry a controller or a computer to operate a drone, we can imagine that soldiers will one day have electroencephalogram sensors in their helmets so that they can direct an attack and surveillance drones. A military scout could, for example, control a drone and have it fly over an adjacent ridge, sending back pictures of the enemy's position to his headset. So too, a police officer equipped with a mind-controlled drone could quickly and readily get a tactical picture of a hostage situation. As with GPS trackers, this potential ease of use would also present grave risks of misuse. The example of the teeny constable on the horse-drawn carriage envisioned by Justice Alito in the Jones case would become a mobile miniature observation platform everywhere. Now let's turn to artificial intelligence, or what many prefer to call autonomous learning machines. First, an important distinction lies in the word learning. There are many autonomous machines in existence already, everything from robots on the automobile assembly line to the missile targeting system for the Aegis anti-missile cruisers on some of our naval ships. While these semi-autonomous machines can operate independent of human control, hence the autonomous part of the name, they're not generally adaptive. They don't learn from experience. They don't adapt to unanticipated situations. They only do what they're programmed to do. Learning machines are different. They can adapt. They can learn from success or failure. They soon might be able to build a mathematical model of a future choice and make predictive judgments based on that model, and then evaluate the result and modify the model. In short, they're programmed to be capable of doing things that are unexpected and unanticipated. They might not have souls, so we can't call them alive according to traditional meaning, but there's something else that is very important. They are surprising. Think, for example, of the programming required to operate a driverless car. It has to adapt in the same way a human driver might to situations it hasn't seen before. It turns out that many of the best performing driverless vehicle algorithms share a common trait. Humans have not explicitly programmed them. David Savins, a Stanford University computer scientist, wrote about Junior, which is an autonomous car that earned Stanford's second place in the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency's Urban Challenge. He said, "Our work does not rely on manual engineering or even supervised machine learning. Rather, the car learns on its own, training itself without human teaching or labeling." These types of challenges are fraught with some of the same issues of control and democracy that we've been examining throughout this course on surveillance. American University law professor Kenneth Anderson wrote about some of the moral perils of automation in a provocative essay he titled Law and Ethics for Robot Soldiers and published in Policy Review. Anderson asks, "Is it simply wrong per se to take the human moral agent entirely out of the firing loop? In other words, is it wrong as a matter of principle to create robotic agents that act without human control?" The issue, Anderson writes, raises a further question as to what constitutes the tipping point in impermissible autonomy, given that the automation of weapons is likely to occur in incremental steps. Now, Anderson believes that autonomous weapon systems that remove the human being from the firing loop are unacceptable because they undermine the possibility of holding anyone accountable for what, if it had been done by a human soldier, might be a war crime. Who should be responsible for mistakes? Thinking about that, Anderson offers these possible answers. The engineer or the designer who programmed it in the first place? But he concludes, without holding civilians and soldiers hostage, so to speak, to accountability, political leaders would be tempted to resort to war more than they ought. Precisely the same objection can be raised with respect to remotely piloted drones. Or to put it in my own words more directly, if robots make mistakes and nobody is responsible, politicians may be more likely to use robots. They get the benefit of what the robots do without the burden of being blamed for what goes wrong. And what is true of weapon systems is equally true, it seems to me, of any autonomous learning machine with surveillance capability. It is a real risk to society if we remove the element of human control from our machines. One is reminded of the prophetic end of Arthur C. Clarke's movie, 2001, A Space Odyssey. HAL, the autonomous machine that controls many basic functions on a permanent space station anchored high above Earth, notices that Dave Bowman, the remaining pilot, is trying to deactivate him. Hal complains, "Hey, Dave, what are you doing? Dave, I don't understand why you're doing this to me. I have the greatest enthusiasm for the mission. You are destroying my mind." Some of the greatest thinkers of our time, men like Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk, all share similar concerns. They worry that artificial intelligence is a grave threat to humanity. I am not sure that they are right, but I am sure that the surveillance, data collection, and analytical capabilities we've been talking about in this course are, in effect, a force multiplier. Even under human control, such powerful systems shift the balance of authority towards those who control them. That's what generates such a significant counter-reaction from the public. One does not need to be a Luddite or an apocalyptic visionary to see that if these various systems of surveillance were under autonomous control, outside of the capability of human intervention, the shift in practical authority would be magnified, just like when HAL accumulated power in the movie 2001. To some, this speculative picture of the future is dystopian, and without appropriate democratic controls, I suppose it might be. But I would be remiss if I didn't also point out some more utopian possibilities. The idea of mind control of an inanimate object, for example, lies at the core of possibly revolutionary prosthetic devices. A woman named Jan Schweirman, who has been paralyzed from the neck down for years, had sensors embedded in part of her brain, the part that controls motion. And those sensors read electrical impulses and now allow her to control a robotic arm. As a result, she can move objects and lift them. This is an example of how machine and humankind, metal and flesh, might extend our potential. And if artificial intelligence scares you, take heart. You might recall IBM's stellar computer program Watson, which won a Jeopardy game showdown against the greatest human champion to have ever played on this TV show, a man named Ken Jennings. To prevail, the IBM program used deep learning and cognitive computing to understand natural language problems and to reason to find the right answer. Today, IBM is taking that same deep learning technology and deploying it to allow Watson to participate in health decisions. It can pull together vast quantities of data about health, disease, nutrition, lifestyle, and individual and collective medical histories. From this data, Watson can extrapolate and author hypotheses about diagnosis and treatment in ways that are likely to lead to better health outcomes. All of which is really simply another way of restating a basic premise of this course on surveillance, that technologies are generally neutral. It's how they're employed that is of concern. And that means that our principal focus should be on questions of accountability and oversight. Get it right, and we have Watson. Get it wrong, and we have Hal, trying to outwit the human space commander Dave. The names Bradley Manning, Julian Assange, and Edward Snowden are by now familiar to most Americans, and certainly to everyone who's taken this course. Some think them heroes and patriots, others consider them villains and traitors. This dichotomy reflects what I have come to think of in creating this series as the fundamental tension, the perpetual and unsteady equilibrium between secrecy and transparency, between security and freedom, that pervades American society. I say fundamental because in many senses the tensions are ineradicable and inherent in the structure of American government. They require us to consider and reconcile two cherished values: limited government and effective government. Americans value limited government because humans value freedom, and frequently think that government is as much a threat to freedom as it is an enabler of it. And so we value checks on government excess so highly that, for example, the right to freedom of speech is enshrined in the First Amendment. The converse of this, distrust of government, is a foundational insight of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration is an assertion that the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are inalienable and belong to us by virtue of our humanity, and they are not in any way derived from or granted by government. And likewise, we see rights of privacy and security against government intrusion as critical components of our rights as citizens. At the same time, however, we want a government that works and works well. The desire for order and government protection from threats stretches at least as far back as the Hobbesian concern that without communal security, life is nasty, mean, brutish, and short. That concern finds strong echoes in the constitutional preamble, which sets as one of the priorities that the new government should provide for the common defense. Before the Constitution, the new nation's first attempts to draft a blueprint for democratic government was something called the Articles of Confederation, which proved to be inadequate to the task. The Constitution itself was therefore a reaction against ineffective government and the chaos of an ungoverned society. Indeed, the framers of the Constitution sought to create a stronger government, one that Alexander Hamilton so famously described as possessing energy in the executive. Throughout U.S. history, Americans have confronted crisis with strong executive action, sometimes action that trenches close to or even crosses the line of the law. Examples abound, ranging from President Abraham Lincoln's unilateral suspension of the writ of habeas corpus to President Franklin Roosevelt's covert aid to Britain in World War II in contravention of the Neutrality Act. More recently, and perhaps more controversially, we saw strong executive branch action in the wake of foreign terror attacks on U.S. soil on September 11, 2001. Our responses, many of which we have talked about in this course, ranged from covert surveillance to military responses. But one thing unites many of these examples: the need in some part for secrecy in execution. Roosevelt's circumvention of the Neutrality Act to assist Britain during World War II would have been stopped had it been widely known to a still isolationist Congress. Secrecy was essential also to the successful Navy SEAL operation targeting Osama bin Laden. The New York Times report sometime afterward that the National Security Agency had developed the capability to penetrate computers in China inevitably meant that it would become less effective as China took steps to thwart it, with resulting effects on American security that could not be publicly known or predicted. In short, secrecy is sometimes crucial to effectiveness. But secrecy and transparency are often in equipoise. Too much transparency threatens security, and too much secrecy threatens liberty. Late in the Vietnam War, the unauthorized leak of the Pentagon Papers involving the publication of a Defense Department analysis of the military campaign reminded us that governments often use secrecy to conceal mistakes or misconduct, like the FBI surveillance of Americans in the 1970s as part of a wayward counterintelligence program, or simply to avoid embarrassment. Thomas Jefferson once said, "The natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. We must guard against this natural tendency." Philosopher John Locke wrote, "In all states of created beings capable of laws, where there is no law, there is no freedom. For liberty is to be free from the restraint and violence from others, which cannot be where there is no law, and is not, as we are told, a liberty for every man to do what he likes." Thus, the obligation of government is a dual one: to protect civil safety and security against violence and to preserve civil liberties. That dual obligation remains at the center of the surveillance liberty debate. I'll summarize this dual obligation or responsibility with a quip and a quote. The quip is, "Doctors bury their mistakes. Government officials classify theirs." That reflects the skepticism with which we view official secrecy and surveillance. It is as much a barrier to accountability as it is an enabler of effective action. The quote comes from the late Army Lieutenant General Vernon A. Walters, a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. He said, quote, "Americans have always had an ambivalent attitude toward intelligence. When they feel threatened, they want a lot of it. And when they don't, they regard the whole thing as somewhat immoral." And that, too, I think, describes the fundamental tension. Americans want an effective government, but it has to be circumscribed by law and policy. This may represent a false choice, that you can either have transparency, accountability, and liberty, or you can have secrecy, surveillance, and effectiveness. If we really were put to such a choice, it would be difficult, indeed almost existential, a question to answer. But the United States can, and indeed does, reflect transparency and secrecy, accountability and effectiveness. Our goal should be to maximize both values. At bottom, this course is not about resolving the fundamental tensions that exist permanently in American democracy. It's about managing them, living with them, and accommodating the competing values to the maximum extent practicable. We all want to be safe. We all want an effective government that can provide national security. And we all want one that acts within the rule of law. We all want a government that is transparent and accountable, not despotic. And we all want a legal and policy structure that fosters our desires. Sometimes the country gets the balance wrong. Far more often, as is to be expected in a pluralistic society, citizens simply disagree about precisely how to achieve the ends we seek. You've seen much of that disagreement play out in this course. But the discussion and the tensions I've articulated are emblematic of the values of competing ideas. They reflect a living, breathing aspect of a functioning democracy. In the realm of policy and law, we attempt continually to square the circle of security and liberty, never succeeding, and quite possibly never really expecting that we can succeed. Rather, this unending tension calls for us to continually rebalance and re-examine fundamental values, trying our best to give effect to both as circumstances permit. And that, it seems to me, is as good a place as any to end our adventure. Back where we started, in the hospital room of the U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft, at the height of the war on terror, debating whether security and liberty can coexist and asking whether or not a democracy like ours can manage surveillance within the bounds of law rather than outside of it. I want to thank you very much for joining me in this conversation, and thank you for participating. I hope you've enjoyed the experience and that in the end, you've learned something of value and interest.